Welcome back to the channel, everybody. So, today I want to talk with you about archaeology. Archaeology, of course, being one of the main subfields of anthropology. And, I think one of the big things that separates archaeology from, say, some of the other subfields that we've talked about in anthropology is that in most cases, the people that we want to learn more about, they're actually long gone. So, meaning, we can't interview them, we can't observe them in real time, we can't participate in their activities. So, really, the only thing that we have to go by are these, little material traces that people of the past have left behind, meaning they're artifacts. In archaeology, we define artifacts as any material that is made or is manipulated by humans. So, in that, sort of essence, an artifact can be a stone that ancient humans manipulated into a tool, a stone tool like a knife, an arrowhead, a projectile point. Artifacts can also be things like pottery. They can also be things like maybe the tablet or the smartphone or the, PC that you're working on right now, the pen you're holding, whatever you're using to take notes on and with. There's this misconception, I think, that outsiders have that, for an artifact to be an artifact, it has to be old. And this is really like one of those myths that we try to bust here in anthropology. It really just isn't the case. In fact, one emerging specialty within archaeology, it's actually not very old. It's called contemporary archaeology, and I love it. It's the study of the present and the study of the recent past through things, through artifacts. And it's actually an area that, I've actually become very interested in myself over the last couple of years. But, it's through the process of excavating archaeological sites that, we have this opportunity to uncover glimmers of the past, really. A site is really any place where material evidence exists about the human past. So, really any place where there is a residue left in the ground of human activity. Now, as an archaeologist, when I'm excavating a site, I don't just grab and go. So it's not like Indiana Jones where you're looking for one thing, you grab it and you go and you get out of there. In reality, archaeology is a very slow process, and it's one that involves systematically removing layers of soil. And we peel back these layers of soil so that we can expose, so that we can document, and also collect artifacts, bringing them back into a lab so that we can process them, study them, and learn from them even more. So it's like we take these clues from the past, we piece them together to try and create a story that's based on evidence that we recover, but a story about past human communities, stories about past human experiences. I think I may have said this in an earlier video, but doing archaeology to me really is like piecing together a puzzle, except you don't know what the picture is going to look like until the puzzle is completely assembled. And archaeology, of course, has great potential to illuminate, so much about the past. Things like, time or chronology, when it was that an event took place. Archaeology can tell us where on a landscape a certain event took place. The kinds of things people, of the past ate. So we can get at diet, we can get at gender roles, craft technologies, spirituality, symbolism. We really can get at a lot through archaeology. Now, one of the most common questions that I actually get as an archaeologist is how do you know where to dig? So it's like, how do you start the whole process? It's the year 2023, and we have a lot of methods at our disposal right now, methods that have been built up for the last 100, 150 years of the history of archaeology that help us determine the approximate location of sites and the boundaries of the site. So where is it on the landscape that a site starts and where does it stop? So in some cases, the remnants of a site, they actually can be visible on the ground, like literally visible on the ground surface. So we might encounter things like artifact scatters directly on the ground, or perhaps even see curious looking features like mounds or depressions that, can kind of clue us in. They can indicate that someone once lived here in the past. In a lot of cases, we're not as lucky though. In other cases, sites can be revealed through historic documents. So maps, property deeds, for example, they can provide clues about a site's location, also can kind of hint at maybe where a structure may have been once located. In other instances, sometimes we determine the location of a site by talking with people, literally by communicating with people in a given community. So by interviewing people or recording, their oral history, that sometimes can help us determine the location of a site. Sagas and stories can also be helpful. These are like written versions of stories or oral histories, and these can hint at the location of a site. A famous example, the Viking saga, is actually super instrumental in identifying the location of a site called Lansio Meadows. This was a really notable Viking site in Newfoundland, Canada, one that actually had been connected to Leif Erikson. So sagas and stories. This one is kind of maybe lesser known by outsiders, but is actually one of the more common ways that we find sites. Construction projects. They often accidentally reveal hidden archaeological sites. Famous example is the discovery of Dutch explorer Adrian Block's ship. His ship was called the Tiger, and it was a ship that he used to explore the east coast of North America. The ship was lost in a fire in 1613, though, while it was anchored in Manhattan. And it wasn't until about 300 years later that the ship was discovered. It was discovered in 1916 by James Kelly when he and his crews were digging Manhattan subway tunnels near the World Trade Center. So sometimes we find them, just by doing construction. Famous example. Sometimes sheer luck, when we aren't looking for one, sometimes it just appears, while you're hiking outside, while you're swimming in nature. The other thing maybe that needs to be said here is that, unlike rock shelters or, like the Great Pyramids in Egypt, which are above ground, of course, most archaeological finds, especially those in Europe, especially those here, like on the east coast of the US, in these places, soil actually accrues very fast. So a lot of sites are actually buried. They're buried well below ground surface. So we need to, kind of look at different kind of instruments, consult different kinds of instruments to help us look beneath the surface to see what potentially could lay beneath there. And I'll just go over two quick ones maybe for us right here. Shovel testing is a very commonly used technique that's used to find sites that are buried in the ground. And these shovel tests are laid out over a survey area in a grid. And the process really involves digging relatively shallow pits with a shovel, usually on the order of about 3 feet deep, across the surface area in systematic intervals of, say, every 30 feet, every 50 feet, for example, really depending on how much of a site you want to sample. And the purpose of doing this shovel test, of course, is to determine the location of a site and to look for its boundaries based on, artifact densities. If we're finding a lot of artifacts and say this section right here, that's going to clue us that this is probably the location of the site that we need to dig at. One last tool I'll mention, these are quite sophisticated and they've been developed over the last 50 to 60 years. It's a whole suite of tools that fall under the umbrella of remote sensing. Remote sensing really is wonderful. It's another tool that we have in our kit to help us locate sites. We like it because it's non-invasive. It's almost kind of like akin to taking an MRI, like taking an MRI of the ground. There are a number of remote sensing technologies available to us, ground penetrating radar, soil resistivity, magnetometry, even metal detecting, which you've probably heard of before, is actually a type of remote sensing technique. But what they all share in common, and this is why we like it, is their ability to see beneath the surface without excavating like a single grain of soil. So it's like taking a snapshot of what's beneath the surface without setting a shovel to it. Now, there are a lot of specialties within the discipline of archaeology. So some of us specialize in the study of plants and animals. Others work with human remains. That's bioarchaeology. Some of us, and I did a lot of this when I was, a little earlier on in my career. I still think it's cool. Some of us work mostly with experiments to figure out how something may have been, done in the past, made in the past. Artifact conservation is another really interesting specialty area of archaeology. So if you ever take Intro to Archaeology with me, which I really teach all the time, we actually survey all of these plus more in a lot more detail. But beyond the scope of what we need to do today, really what I want to focus on for you are the three main specialty areas of archaeology, okay? So these are prehistoric archaeology. It's the first one we'll go over, historical archaeology, and then we'll cap the talk off with a little bit on contemporary archaeology. So let's start with prehistoric. So prehistoric archaeologists, they use archaeology, I kind of think of it as this pure line of evidence to understand the past. And generally, they don't have access to written records. This is a key distinction between some of the other ones. So prehistoric archaeologists, they don't have access to written records produced by the past people of whom they're studying. So, really, in essence, prehistoric archaeology is the archaeology of people for whom we have no written records of. Prehistoric archaeologists tend to specialize, societies at more of a collective scale rather than at the individual scale. And this really is because, people in this, deeper part of time, really so many of them, if not all of them, are basically anonymous in the archaeological record. And again, this is because we have zero documents that capture them. But prehistoric archaeologists are actually able to study, quite a bit. Things like, diet, things like how people met their material needs, the kind of technologies that people had, what sort of specialties, craft specialties, were common in a particular society, like pottery or flint knapping, meaning making stone tools. We're also learning a lot about, prehistoric art and artistry and aesthetic, which I find rather interesting. Now, one thing that prehistoric archaeologists deal with that really has captured me very recently is the question of when did behavioral modernity emerge? Meaning, like, when did fully human behavior based on symbolic thought and cultural creativity, when did this emerge? Becoming fully human, not just anatomically, which we've talked about in a previous episode, but becoming, modern in terms of behavior. It's a little bit different. So generations of archaeologists have actually traced this very question back to Europe during a time when creativity seems to have just given birth. It seems to have just all of a sudden just started pulsing with life. And this was around 45,000 years ago. There's an archaeologist, Richard Klein, who thinks that, this is something that happened very suddenly. It's called the dawn of culture moment. And this is because human behavior really seems to have appeared to have blossomed so dramatically. Um, at about this point in time, about 45,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, they were making varied and complex stone tools. We know that they were adorning themselves. They were adorning their bodies with things like paint, jewelry, other ornaments. We know they were burying their dead with ceremony and ritual. These are the same people who are making those iconic Venus figurines, which basically almost everybody has heard about, even outside of archaeology today. And we also know these people were beginning to paint very striking images in caves. In fact, over 100 cave painting sites have actually been identified just in southwest France and northeast Spain alone. Lascaux, which you might have heard of, Lascaux Cave is actually among the more famous of these, although it's dated a little bit later. But it's kind of neat to talk about. Artists here were painting pretty much big game prey. So horses, woolly mammoth, cattle, deer, reindeer especially. What's interesting though is how it's been interpreted. So most archaeologists think the images actually represent acts of magic, of ritual, of divination. A lot of the animals are speared. Some believe maybe setting the intention in paint on limestone cave walls for future successful hunts. Setting intention really is a key part of magic, of magical process. Now, in some of the other images, we see pregnant animals, we see copulating animals, and this could be instances of what we call ceremonies of increase. Ceremonies of increase are still practiced today in remote areas, but they are still practiced today by Australian Aboriginals, for example, and they use ceremonies like these to promote fertility using magic. So something that's, believed necessary to perpetuate like these species that humans rely on. So cave art seems to reflect ancient magical practices, and some of us are thinking that caves like Lascaux may have actually been the earliest temples, the earliest places for ritual and for ceremony. So all of these very symbolic activities that involve creative ways of thinking and expressing oneself appear to have exploded in Europe about 45,000 years ago. There is some thinking that maybe a genetic mutation that occurred a little bit before this, maybe 50,000 years ago, may have actually rewired the brain and improved communication, kind of permitting this fluorescence of activity, of creativity. Just for your reference, this is something that's been called the neurological hypothesis for behavioral modernity. Now, here's where things get really interesting to me. There have been a lot of other really interesting finds outside of Europe that suggest behavioral modernity is way older than 45,000 years ago. So, for example, we've been recovering jewelry, some of which appears to be made from rare items. We're finding carvings, we're finding paintings, even fine, bone and stone tools. These have all been identified in the Middle East, in Africa, and are even more ancient than the European findings we were just talking about. Just an example here, there's a very compelling site. It's one of my favorite ones to talk about, actually. It's called Bloembos Cave, located in South Africa. It's about 200 miles east of Cape Town, and it's on a cliff that faces the Indian Ocean. Site dates to about 100,000 years ago. We think it was an artist's workshop. That's right. You heard me correct. 100,000 years ago, 100,000-year-old artist's workshop. And it's the first of its kind, honestly, that we know of that is this ancient. So Bloembos produced hundreds of pieces of red ochre, along with ochre stained tools that were used for processing it. Now, ochre is found naturally in the earth. It's essentially clay that's pigmented with hematite, and that's really what makes it red in color. But because of the mineral quality, it doesn't wash away. So it can preserve for very, very, very long periods of time. The powdered ochre, though, would have been mixed and was mixed here with fluid, fat, probably mammal bone marrow, actually, to create paint, to create pigment. And the paint actually appears to have been prepared in these beautiful abalone shell containers that we've recovered from the site, almost like an artist's palette, if you will. Now, red ochre processing, this is something that's been identified at actually a lot of prehistoric sites around the world. But again, none as old as Bloembos that I'm currently aware of. So it was this widely used material throughout, prehistory. For cave painting. So it was used in artistry. It was also used for decorating the body, perhaps as a social statement or signaling group identity or status. It was used for ritual interment of human remains, and we know this because we see human remains that are stained with ochre. What's interesting also is that the color is evocative of blood. So we're thinking that ochre may have symbolized the fluid for life and death, of menstruation and fertility. So Bloembos and some other sites too are showing us that becoming behaviorally modern may have actually been kind of like this slow process, one that began in Africa before it reached Europe. Now, some of us are considering the role of psychedelics, the role that psychedelics may have played in the process of becoming, really behaviorally modern. Psychedelics like psilocybin, otherwise known as magic mushrooms, we are now thinking that magic mushrooms may have played a role in establishing new neural pathways that really enhanced, creative thinking of humans that lived many tens of thousands of years ago, if not 100,000 years ago. Creative thinking that almost was at the verge of a kind of awakening. It was that kind of next level, if you will. What's interesting is that the geometric motifs that we are seeing in some early cave paintings around the world actually resemble images that you would see in an altered state of consciousness. So it's almost as if these artists were bringing their inner world to the outer world through their paintings. So historical archaeology is another main specialty area of archaeology. And historical archaeologists, they study, the material record left by humans with the assistance of written records. So it's like a marriage between the historical record and the material record, archaeology. So they use documents like wills, manifests, ledgers, journals, maps to aid in their interpretation of archaeological sites. So in the US, historical archaeology, really studies the last 500 years or so. But in other parts of the world, the historic period, of course, begins much earlier. And thus, archaeologists have access to records that extend much deeper in time. In Ireland, Latin was introduced by Christianizing groups somewhere around AD 431. So, archaeology on sites in Ireland that date to 431 or after, they would have what we call a historical component to them. Now, one challenge that historical archaeologists have faced is like, why bother with documents if, we have records of the past? Or why bother with the archaeology if we have documents, that give us a record of the past, I mean? Well, quite simply, historic records, they're not complete accounts. So records can be very selective, about the information they capture. Records might not even be correct, and they can be colored with personal bias. This is especially true for records that would have been written by white slave owners about the people of color that they owned, that they forced to, of course, labor. So historical archaeologists, they're really interested in topics like the lives of working class people, the lives of enslaved people, indentured laborers, the experience of children, of women, interested in, how people in the past experienced processes like colonialism, capitalism, the earlier days of globalization, for example. And one site that I like to talk about here as an example for historical archaeology is Donna Seifert's work on Hooker's Division, located in Washington, D.C.'s historic red light district. So the story goes, the history part of it says that during the American Civil War, Major General Joseph Hooker and his troops were stationed in DC, but there was like this growing concern that off-duty soldiers were like flooding the nation's capital for saloons or bars, in addition to fast women. So these establishments were condensed into ultimately what became known as Hooker's Division, this sort of red light district that operated literally within sight of the White House. Now, there were few economic opportunities for women in the mid 19th century, but brothel work was women's work. And this was nothing new for the time, though. Women have supported themselves by working in the sex industry for literally thousands of years. One of the earliest examples that I had come across when I was researching this a little bit more dates to at least as early as 2400 BP, years before the present, and that's coming from ancient Sumerian culture. We would imagine it goes back further than that, but that's one of the earliest instances that I could find. But again, just as it continues now, sex work was and still is a way that people earn a living. So women entered brothel work at Hooker's Division to make money, to increase their social mobility, to achieve a higher standard of living. A lot of them entered actually to cope with a sudden change in income, like say after their husband passed away. In fact, it probably was one of the higher paying industries at this time for women, despite being, totally taboo to engage in. It totally went against the vision that 19th century polite society held women to. So the archaeology here actually recovered a lot of clothing relating artifacts, maybe not a surprise. So a lot of buttons. A lot of armaments were recovered too, probably speaking to the need for security in a dangerous profession. We're finding a lot of smoking pipes here, probably used to entertain clients and guests. Also finding a great deal of lighting glass, so glass fragments from chandeliers, speaking to the time of day in which business operated. A good deal of religious artifacts were recovered too. Personal artifacts, a lot of personal artifacts recovered. So jewelry, combs, mirror fragments, speaking probably to the emphasis on bodily adornment and the women's presentation of self in their workplace. So the excavations here capture, the material dimension of one of the few wage labor options that women had access to in the 19th century. And it was so taboo in nature that details were legit left off record. So this is one of the ways that archaeology gets to show its ability to illuminate the past in ways that historic documents and ways that records simply can't get at, because this is something that went off the books. It was off record. So that's historical archaeology. Contemporary archaeology is the last specialty of archaeology that I want to cover for you. This is a newer specialty, by the way. It's one that I really have loved to come to work in myself. And I feel like it kind of is beginning to define maybe my generation's, where my generation is taking archaeology, where millennials are taking archaeology. It's different. It's different because it focuses on the most recent, the 20th century, 21st century past, and also increasingly explores the application of archaeological thinking to the contemporary present day world. So contemporary archaeologists, they literally look at the very recent material record to learn about communities that exist in the present or the very recent past. It actually is a field that lies at the crossroad between archaeology and cultural anthropology. One of the earliest contemporary archaeology studies was led by William Rathje. It's Rathje. That's difficult to sound out, probably. And he led this project in the 1960s. So he and his students studied the contents of Tucson residents' waste to examine their patterns of consumption. So they're literally looking at trash of residents in Tucson, Arizona in the 60s. And the results actually showed that the information that people freely volunteered about their consumption habits on paper like didn't match the contents of their waste bin. So what people said they threw out either wasn't there or there was a large quantity of it. So the record, the actual documents never really matched the material record. So alcohol consumption is an example that comes to mind. Alcohol consumption was proven to be significantly higher in reality than in the questionnaires that were completed by people before the study. So people said, oh, we only drink, a couple beers a week or whatever. But in reality, what they found in their waste baskets is that they were drinking like cases of it. So the findings are really kind of interesting, though, because they almost begin to cast doubt on the reliability of documents when applied to historical sites. Now, somebody else's work also comes to mind here. This is the work of Jason DeLeon. He's a personal favorite. I will say that. I love his book. It's called Land of Open Graves. It was published in, I believe, 2015. And I started following DeLeon's work some years ago when I was actually writing my own dissertation, and it really just influenced the path that I ended up taking in archaeology and how I really think about the past, really, and the more recent events. So one of the things that contemporary archaeologists do actually is bear witness to things that are unfolding right now in the present. And that's what Jason DeLeon is doing. He is photographing and documenting several thousand migrant open graves across the punishingly hot Sonoran Desert. And he does it in painstaking detail. He's documenting every little clue, from skeletal disarticulation to the items that are found with decedents. And this is something that archaeologists do no matter the time period that they are researching. And in my opinion, I think DeLeon's research is really quite exceptional because it illuminates a missing piece in the discussion of immigration. And that missing piece really is the experience of human suffering and hardship. If you go on to read, more into his work, you'll notice his attention to the objects that are found with decedents, from religious ephemera like prayer cards to bloody socks, even to sneakers that are so worn out that they're held together. They're like tied together with a bra strap. So the objects that he discusses, they become this testament really to the brutal experience that's endured by migrants as they're crossing into the United States. And, I think DeLeon sees migration as an effect of globalization. Often people, think of the good things that globalization, brings about, which is true: airplanes, high-speed internet, effective medical treatments, and whatnot. On the other hand, though, I think DeLeon's work is asking us to consider the uneven development that it creates. So, what I mean is that globalization does leave people out. And in his work, in his book, Land of Open Graves, we learn that the decision to embark across the desert, this is a decision that's one of last resort. Migrants see the trek, as dangerous as it is, as a chance to escape, poverty, cartel violence, and corruption in their homeland, as globalization just continues to exacerbate, these income inequalities. So a little bit on contemporary archaeology. So I think this episode feels pretty complete to me. And what I tried to do was give you an orientation to what archaeology is, how we do it, and teach you a bit about some of the, specialty areas in the field and, what we can learn from them. So hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to be notified when I release additional videos. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Bye-bye.